We're good. We're good. David. I was at St. Luke's. I was not here. My dad spoke.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? All right. I know this is the sleepy hour, but we've got a really good, rousing panel up here, and so I hope that will keep you alert. And if you do need to take that nap, hey, we're not saying a word about it. I would like to, I hope they're there. I would like to introduce two special guests that we have here today. As you heard Doug Weaver mention, one of the authors of one of the chapters in Claypool, Raymond Bailey, who wrote the chapter on preaching, has died, but we're so happy that his wife, Pat Bailey, is here. And also we have here Ruth Wagoner. Ruth did actually a little more than transcribe. I think Raymond would dictate or just talk about what he wanted to go in the book, and she helped put it in the computer and produce a final copy. So we're just delighted that both of them are here with us. Would you all mind to stand? And I'd just like to say personally, I really wish Raymond were here today. He was my homiletics professor at Southern Seminary and always a big support and encourager of women in ministry. I really appreciated that. And Pat got me through the heresy trial that I went through in Chicago. She was up there doing chaplaincy ministry at Cook County Hospital, which was a lot of social work. So we're just delighted that you could be with us today. I think when we're finished this afternoon, then we will reconvene this evening at 6:30 for the banquet. So you'll have some time to rest, and if you're going to hang around the church, that's just fine. Make yourself comfortable. So I'm just delighted that all of you are still with us and look forward to this time that we have with the panel. And Ron Claypool will be making some introductions.
So, yes, very grateful to have this panel. When we were thinking about the structure of the book, it was obvious that we would want to do Dad's respective tenures at the churches. That was obvious enough. But then it was clear that there were these overarching themes that also needed to be accounted for. And so this is the panel reflective of those themes. And I'm very grateful to our panelists for their contribution to the book. And then we've invited Mira Corlett as a special guest to talk about Dad as healer. Our thought was that Dad's work with grieving was so ever present in all of the book that we didn't need a standalone chapter, but it's wonderful to have her on this panel. And then David Hull is stepping in and helping us with Dad as preacher, with Dr. Kevin Cosby also addressed some last night. But one thing I think for me, it's been, this has been an intense preparation and now day. And I think it's also got some great sense of humor to it. When Jason said that he was going to go do some electrical work, you know, that's the last thing you would have looked to John Claypool to do. He was completely ill-equipped to do anything practical at all. in some ways, and I think this just only extenuated as he went through his career, he was able to live in a progressively bigger bubble where he was able to so focus in. And Doug Weaver, I think, made a really good point about Dad's tenure at Northminster, where he got to really focus in on his craft as a preacher, and that sort of set him on a path that was unique. So I'm going to invite Chandler to tell a story about Dad's final commencement address to McAfee as one of the great stories, I think, among many about Dad. But I want to thank our panelists and then turn it over to Chandler as our moderator.
Hello. It's wonderful to see you. This is a really exciting for me. I love Dr. Claypool, and I have corresponded with Rowan for years, but we've never seen each other in person. And the first thing Rowan said to me when he saw me is, "I thought you had more hair." And I told him I did. Before I was a pastor, I had a beautiful full head of hair. Well, it was beautiful, but it was a full head of hair. But it's an honor to be here. I will share the graduation story during my time. But Dr. Claypool taught me many things. He taught me some things through speech, some things through reading his books, and some things through watching him. And one of the things that I observed in every class that I ever heard him teach was that we don't start without prayer. And so with that in mind, I'm going to open us up in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for so many people willing to come through so many avenues of Dr. Claypool's life to be here. We are just so grateful for all the work that's been put into this. As we remember him, it's been 17 years, and I know he knows, but let his family know that we still think of him. He's still making an impact in this day. And as we discuss his life, above all, what he would want us to be discussing is the merger between finding meaning and mystery in life. So as through our words today about our beloved friend, please open the doors to mystery and meaning in new ways that empower us. In your name, amen. We will be going through the book. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. But the first chapter that our panel will be dealing with was written by Steve Shoemaker and Rowan Claypool. I told Steve that with Dr. Buechner's passing, he is now my favorite living preacher, so no pressure on you to be great. But you all know him better than I do because he was a pastor here. He's been a pastor at Myers Park, at Broadway, and has written 9 books. And if you have not checked out his website, everything on there is absolutely brilliant and free, and I can't endorse him more. And his partner today will be Rowan Claypool, Dr. Claypool's oldest son, who runs 2 nonprofits here in the Louisville area and is just an absolutely wonderful human. So without further ado.
Well, I'm grateful that Rowan asked me to write this chapter and that he accepted my challenge that I would if he wrote it with me. As a segue from the last session, am I holding the mic about the right amount of distance from my mouth? Okay.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up, okay. A kind of funny story. Oh, as a segue, I think John's ministry was a sacramental ministry from the very beginning. The offering of the grace of God to us. As he would say over and over again, grace, God is a mystery, and the mystery is gracious. The message of grace over and over again. My first experience as an inheritor of his pastoral ministry was when I came to Crescent Hill and went to see a woman post-op. It was in the recovery room, and because I was a man of the cloth, they let me in to see her, and she, in a haze, after I prayed with her, said, "Thank you, Dr. Claypool." And I said, "You're most welcome." I was honored to be a stand-in for Dr. Claypool. As I thought about Claypool as a pastor, I first wanted some images of a pastor that he exemplified. And I first went to a seminal book by McNeil called The History of the Care of Souls. And in that book, the history of the cure of souls, it's also the care of souls that's been used since then. He said that a pastor is a physician of the soul. And I thought that exemplifies the kind of pastor that John Claypool was. The cure of souls, the care of souls. And then I went to Wayne Oates' book on the Christian pastor, and he defined the different roles of the Christian pastor as friendship, comfort, confession, teaching, and brief pastoral dialogue. And I think that we have experienced John Claypool's pastoral ministry, not only from the pulpit, but for the way he lived alongside us in all of these kind of capacities. His preaching went from the pulpit to the pastor's office, to the way he greeted people, back to the pulpit. Another thing that I think exemplified his role as a pastor was how he taught us to live with a tragic sense of life. That phrase comes from Miguel Unamuno's book on the tragic sense of life. I was sitting in a church where he was conducting a funeral one day, and he quoted Unamuno to say, "The chiefest sanctity of a temple is that it is a place where people go to weep in common." And he taught us to live, I think, in the tragic realm of life. Some wishes cannot succeed, some victories cannot be won, some illnesses cannot be cured. We live in the tragic realm, and he taught us to live as those who are under the mercy of God in the midst of the tragic realm of life. There are a number of stories about how he touched people in this chapter, both from Rowan's side and my side, but I would close with this. Maya Angelou said, "People don't remember what you say so much as they remember how you made them feel." And when John Claypool preached, when he talked to us, you felt known and understood. So with that, I'll pass it to his son, who has a view from what he's called the second pew.
Yes, my perspective, and I'm so grateful that Steve agreed to write this chapter. There was a little crisis with the book. That person that we expected to write it couldn't at the last minute, and so we were racing toward the publication deadline, and there was a moment when we might not have a chapter on Dad as pastor, which was unthinkable. And so I'm so grateful to Steve for stepping in, and we did this in quick order. I have it as the perspective of sort of witness. I've spent my whole life in the shadow of Dad's work. It was one of the great good fortunes as a preacher's kid that he did not make his profession my burden. That was a great gift. But what it also meant was that I was around him extending that pastoral care, and then by sort of fiat became a person that others would seek out to tell stories in similar ways. So again, I focused on it on a more personal and witness-like level. Dad had an unbelievable capacity. I mean, I think it was just, there's no way to overstate this. His capacity to accept and receive other people's concerns was just unmatched. And though he carried them, he also kept a joyousness about his own life. It was not that he was not burdened with them, but he also was able to keep some separation. I went sort of back in memory and in discussions with family as to where that capacity originated. And it really, I think, comes from his upbringing and his mother and her Mississippi roots, and this deep, deep awareness of knowing what it is to know someone, which wasn't just to meet them where they are, but to know who stood behind them, what was the constellation of people around them. And I think this was something, as we stood in the receiving line at St. Luke's when he passed away, one person after another came by and talked about when your daddy came to meet with me and my family down in Dothan, it was so lovely because he could talk to us about our aunts and our uncles and our cousins and all the other people in our family. And he always kept that in mind. And I just had that conversation over and over and over again. It was beyond, it was certainly the singular, but it was also this recognition of people's constellations, how they fit in the world. He developed that skill also, in addition to sort of inheriting it from his mother. He was a traveling Bible salesman during college. So he would get dropped off by his senior partner at the bottom of a dirt road, and he would walk up the holler in western North Carolina selling books. And I think what he came to understand is he was going to sell a lot more of those big family Bibles, which has the opportunity for people to list all their family if he talked to them about their family. But from that, he really developed the skill to carry that information with him. So I think it's been said many times over. Mark, you said it very eloquently earlier today. He just had this capacity to be priest, and it was integrated across his work from the pulpit in his daily life with the people that he worked with. And as I was reminded by one of his parishioners from Birmingham at the racquetball club, I mean, it was everywhere. He took it everywhere, and he was able to share it. But it was that capacity, as I've thought about it, that was so remarkable.
Ronald, let me add a couple things. First, as has been noted, there's a seamless character to his life as a pastor and preacher. They were of one piece. And I think we've seen that all through the weekend about how they were of one piece. I also want finally to add, he was an extraordinary pastor to pastors. And a lot of people in this room have been ministered to by John Claypool as a pastor. I don't know how many people have received a call like I did one day when I was at some low point. I can't remember what it was, when he said, "Hello, Steve, this is John."
Thank you so much. The next chapter in the book discusses Dr. Claypool's winter, his final tenure, which was professor at the Maccabee School of Theology in Atlanta from 2002 to 2005. And the chapter in the book was written by Lloyd Allen and Julie Whitten-Long, who could not be here today. You unfortunately get me as a substitute, but I have talked to her about how she'd like it presented. But our next presenter is Lloyd Allen, one L, and as he told many people for years, it makes an L of a difference. He is one of my all-time favorite professors because in addition to teaching something as rigid and concrete as history, he taught something as fluid and wonderful as spirituality. And whereas my students get secondhand Claypool, Dr. Allen had much to offer on his own, but I got secondhand Glenn Henson, so life in his class was absolutely wonderful. And Dr. Allen was taught with him for 3 years, and this is his perspective.
Thank you. Can you hear me? No, I have to use this mic. I was told I could use this mic, but I won't. Thank you. I'm really sorry that Julie could not be here. Julie Whitten-Long, who was a student at the time that Dr. Claypool was there. And she did a great deal of research, and you'll find that in the book from students. Chandler's also offered to be here, and he also has deep insights into that, so I look forward to that. My assignment was to write a chapter on John Claypool as professor, and I was on the faculty there at the time that he was there. So what I'm going to share with you are a few things that I believe are important to understand about that last chapter of his life and his vocation as professor. He was hired because President Kirby Godsey and Dean Allen Culpepper went out, like Northminster did, to hire the best preacher in America. And they got him. And to us on the faculty, He was famous. We were delighted. But to understand John Claypool as a professor, you have to understand his students didn't know who he was. 80% of the students were Baptist, but they'd not known John Claypool as Baptist or known John Claypool at all, unless they were just very fortunate. So, first day he came and taught a 3-hour evening class. He went into a class of, I would guess, 30 or 40 people who saw just one more old white man.
Watch out.
I'm just watching the panels, and I saw him when he came out. We both happened to be coming out of class. I said, "How'd it go?" And he said, "Well, the first 15 minutes, I delivered this pure diamond of a little homily. Then I looked at my watch and I had 2 hours and 45 minutes to go." That story says something about the transition he had to make. He also came in with that transition as professor, as not being the lead dog in the institution in which he was. He had come in from being senior pastor, rector for all those years, and a person of great acclaim. And he came into a place where, I guess after about a month that he was there, I happened to be walking by his office. He said, "Lloyd, can I see you a minute?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can you help me with this computer? I've turned it on and the light is working, but I can't figure out, but it's not working otherwise." But he didn't know you had to turn on the computer and the monitor. And in the book I say, I figure rectors probably have somebody to do that for them. And he didn't have persons to do that for him. Now, the reason I tell those stories is to give you some idea of this huge transition that takes place and how gracefully he transitioned into that kind of experience. Famous speaker, and became a beloved professor. And there's story after story that match the same kinds of experiences you've heard from persons at church and that you will hear from Chandler. And you could hear it from faculty and staff if they were here to talk about his pastoral care among us, as well as his preaching gifts. I also want you to notice that when he comes to this Baptist seminary, he is known only as an Episcopal priest. And he's known only as an Episcopal priest by students who are not Episcopal. So, one of the things that he did that showed his humor and his gentleness, he began many classes, especially if they were classes that were entering students. And he would begin with the line, "Hi, my name's John Claypool. I'm an Episcopalian." If you don't know what that means, we're people who think God likes to be read to. I don't say that he made the shift to professor completely, though he was always fully present to the school, to the students, to the faculty, while at the same time he continued a life of some fame and influence outside. He was gone most weekends. Faculty and students didn't know it. There was a professor that we had who would put up on his board, "Hi, I'm out until Thursday. I'm going to be in Vienna, Austria." To which eventually someone wrote on the board, "We don't give a damn where you are. We just need to know when you're coming back." You would never have known where John Claypool was had you not asked him. And it is that kind of humility. And I mention that because I think it's important to recognize that he is doing that intentionally and with some struggle in his life, if we can trust him, and I do trust him, that drive for success, for being at the top, for being number one, was powerful in his life. And he had conquered it, at least publicly, by the time that he came to us. His ability to give grace remained terribly powerful. Alan Culpepper once, because at McAfee, grade inflation had gotten out of hand. That is, grades were just getting higher and higher and higher. And so he took all the courses that each professor had taught, and he, with the grades with them, and he handed them out at a faculty retreat. And so we're taking this person's grades, this person's grades. I'm sitting there, John Claypool's grades. I said, John, I wish I had your students. Not every one of my students is an A student. And he said in that great voice, well, Lloyd, you never know what burdens people are carrying. So I just think the church ought to offer grace when it can. To which I am pleased to be able to say that I responded, John, this ain't church, this is school. In our conversations here, I have noticed that John Claypool's ministry has a kind of double-sided main themes. And one of them is about social justice. And the other, I think, I'm going to call generally pastoral care. That social justice, the civil rights, the women in ministry. What I like to call his shift from a genteel racism to a genteel liberalism. But the stories that you hear or see when you read the book that students have reported don't often or ever reflect the social justice side. That's not who he was at McAfee. They are full of the pastoral care side. And I want to close by saying, I think that came from his sacramental identity as priest, that he came to us as an Episcopalian, and he offered us the gift of priesthood, founded in sacramental identity. I'm going to read a paragraph from the book in the part that I wrote about his professorship. By sacramental, I mean the potential for a created thing rightly presented to reveal the Holy One within it to those who are ready to receive it. And the Eucharist is sacramental Christianity's prototype of that reality. And John presented that to us. And he honored the Eucharist that we had in our community worship. And one clear way we saw that, we typically practiced intinction. And John would not practice intinction. So wherever he was in the line, by the time he got up to the cup and all the bread was floating around in it, he'd still take the cup out and drink from it and hand it back. But it is not his worship, his liturgical teaching that was so powerful. It was his liturgical being that was so powerful among our students and that had the greatest influence. The phrase is used someplace in one of the other chapters than the one that Julie and I wrote that says, that quotes Marcia McLuhan's, the medium is the message. That's absolutely true. And for me, that's the sacramental side of his full and mature identity. And he had an earthed and sometimes earthy spirituality. I think Weaver said today that I had the most memorable line in the book. I can't tell you what the line is, because it was a statement John made in class one day that won him the MF award at McAfee School of Theology. But I can tell you how one student responded to that earthy line. The student said in the hall after the class, "I never heard that word in class before, nor have I ever heard it sound so holy before." Because John Claypool, sacramental being and teaching, was able to connect earth and heaven in a way to show that the earthy is sacred. And his last great gift to us was that he died among us. His last great gift to us was his sacramental death within McAfee's institution. In a conversation he had with another pastor who had worked at McAfee, John said on Palm Sunday 2004 to this friend, I quote, "Tomorrow I'm going for treatment. They're going to try to put enough poison in my body to kill bad cells and just barely enough not to kill me. I've been sitting here and thinking and praying and wondering if what I've been preaching for 50 years is true enough to hold this. I wanted to call and tell a friend, it is all true. The bottom is holding. It is all true." And he got to live that and proclaim it verbally among our student body and among our faculty. And it was his last great gift to us. He was true right to the end.
Thank you. I was a student at McAfee from 2002 to 2005, where I met Dr. Claypool, and I read Julie's chapter in the book, and she told me to speak on whatever resonated with me. And so I'll just talk about a few things. My experience with him was very ordinary in some ways, in the sense that most encounters with Dr. Claypool, the ordinary was extraordinary. He had an unbelievable ability to be fully present at all times. When Spoonie's David Weatherspoon, who was a little bit older than me at McAfee, a phenomenal student and a big part of the McAfee community, was there, he was going through a divorce, and his father was passing at the same time. And needless to say, it was a really bad time. And Dr. Claypool knew. And more so than most of us, he could identify with both and really could see through what was going on. I've never met anybody with the ability to diagnose the way that he had. And the way that I know that is I met Dr. Claypool because I was an academic. In my second year, he was the only professor on staff I didn't know because I was an academic, and why would I need to know the preacher? Never taken his classes. And then I started going through the depression. Perfectionism got me. My fiance broke up with me, and I hit bottom and did what any grown man ought to do in this situation. I drove back to Knoxville, Tennessee to see my mommy. And I called Claypool the next day, and the reason I called him is I've never had an experience quite like this. I was praying, and something inside me said to call John Claypool, and I don't know where that came from. Didn't know the man. So I called him, left a message on his answering machine, which at the time I did not know was the entire faculty's answering machine, and cried like a baby, explaining to him how upset I was. And his response was, "Son, get back to Atlanta. Go to class tomorrow, and I will take you to any restaurant in Atlanta, and we will stay until you feel you've had your say with me." And he was true to his word. I met him on a Wednesday, and I remember his first words to me. He took one look at me, put his right arm on my shoulder, and said, "I think it's time you accept grace." I was a pompous young man and thought, this pompous old man just said something to me and he doesn't know me well enough to say. But as soon as he said it, I knew he was right. You see, I was a perfectionist as he was. Sometimes when you see another perfectionist, someone who's beaten them into oblivion, it's impossible to hate them. Worst case, you're going to get his sympathy. In best cases, you meet a new friend. I was completely broken, and he recognized that brokenness in my eyes. From the time he met me, he just knew me. And for the next 2 years, I took any chance I could to get to know him, just to be around him, learn from him. I was such a perfectionist this time that I called him on Tuesday, met with him on Wednesday, and in the intervening time, I read 4 of his books because I didn't want to seem ignorant about his work. I was in a bad place. I still accept grace to this day, every day. 20 years later, I have to do it daily because that Protestant capitalist, that work ethic is so deeply ingrained in me. But I would be a mess without the influence of Dr. Claypool. I like to tell people that I got to study under the great Alan Culpepper. And maybe the best thing the great Alan Culpepper ever did for me was hire John Claypool. I want you to know my experience with him was probably your experience, where he was just this wonderful giving of himself and always available. And I think that's something we can all model, whether we have fancy letters after our names or not. When I met him, I started taking his preaching classes, and at that point I decided, I think I want to be a preacher, because you can use this book to help people and heal their wounds. And what better use of it? And the best thing he gave me as a preacher was not any shortcuts to preaching or any bag of tricks. When I came from Knoxville, Tennessee, I was raised in a rural town called Newport, but in my entire life I had never had a pastor who didn't have a doctorate. I had never heard a bad sermon in my life when I went to seminary. I later became a pastor in Rutledge, Tennessee. If you don't know Rutledge, if you need either tomatoes or crystal meth, we've got those in droves, but nothing else. I have heard many a bad sermon since I left McAfee, but none when I got there. I'm really grateful for the pastors I had, so I don't mean to slight them when I say when I stepped on the campus of McAfee, I never heard a great sermon either. And when I heard that man preach, I thought, this is what it's supposed to be like. You can heal people with these words. If you're just open enough to the text, to God, and your own self, you might be able to help the world with this stuff. And I loved the way he taught. It was very similar to the medical community. He preached one, you preached one. In the medical community, I do one, we do one, you do one. It was a beautiful experience. And the goal, again, his goal as a teacher was not for me to teach like John Claypool, but to give me some bread for the journey. And I think he did a wonderful, wonderful job with that. The last thing that maybe not the last thing, close to the last thing I would say is that in response to what Dr. Allen said, where he said to Dr. Claypool, I wish I had your students. I don't have all A students. And the truth is, we were a small school. We were a great community, and I think we generally, for the most part, loved each other. But we went to different classes for different reasons. And Lloyd Allen students were not John Claypool students. And by that, what I mean is, and he will tell you this, the last words I ever said at the McAfee School of Theology, I left campus, I took your final, and the last words I said were, I love you, thank you for teaching me. And I meant it with all my heart. Dr. Allen is one of my favorite professors. But when you took a Lloyd Allen class, you took it because you had to take Baptist history. Spiritual formation was required in a lot of ways. If you took a John Claypool class, it was an elective. None of us had to be there. and there was a demand to be there. And I will be honest, to get a grade in Dr. Culpepper's or Dr. Allen's class was a heck of a lot harder than to get a good grade in Dr. Claypool's class. But I worked my tail off for that man because I just wanted him to respect me. I knew he loved me, but I just wanted his approval, whatever that looked like. And like everything else he taught me, I already had that no matter how hard I worked. But I think the main reason I kept following him around can be found in 2 Kings 2. There's this prophet named Elijah, and he's got a student named Elisha, and Elijah's dying. And the only request Elisha has is, I want a double portion of your spirit when I go. And I don't think I fully knew what that meant until I met John Claypool. I think I just hung around with him just so that maybe some of whatever he had, and it didn't have to do with his intelligence or his education, there is a spirit about that man. I just wanted some of that because it was truly special. The last thing I just, as a person, I want you to know about Dr. Claypool, and it's not important to anything academic or anything that would be in that book. He always preached hope. He was hopeful to the day he died. And it gave me a lot of hope. But even more than that, like everything else about him, he lived that hope. I knew good and well what he had been through. In fact, one of the things I found interesting is this book that's been out. Laura Lou, the name is in there in all but 3 chapters. That's how foundational that moment was to his life. And again, it may not matter to you or anybody else, but I want you to know at the end of his life, he was so happy with Anne. I'd like to think us students, I'd like to think his coworkers helped with that. But Anne was, she just made him so happy. And he had lived out this life with so much tragedy, but at the end, he didn't want to die because he was just so happy doing what he was doing. And that's a very human piece of me, but I want you to know it ended well. He ended on top. I miss him every day, but I'm so honored that I got to study with him. One of the things he did for me, like he's done for many people here, is he was a healer. And Mira, who is a pastor and a counselor, who also was very influenced by his book, Tracks of a Fellow Struggler, will now speak on that. I would say OBC. I did not know how to pronounce your church's name, and I did not want to butcher it in front of you.
Okolona.
Okolona. Oh, I'll just hand her mine.
That's fine. I'm Mara Cassie Corlett, and I want to take a word from Chandler. There was a time that there would be a lot of the professors with whom I studied in this room today. But as I look around, there's only one. And I want to do what Chandler did for Dr. Glenn Henson. I love you. Thanks for teaching me. I'm Mara Cassie Corlett. I am the senior pastor at Okolona Baptist Church. I want you to know that I am greatly honored to be on this panel, but also, as several women have pointed out to me, to be representing the women that have been affirmed by Dr. Claypool, who have been ordained at this church, who saw Baptist women in ministry in its infancy and as it's moved on. I feel in some ways it's a blessing and a curse to be the person up here doing this. But I want you to know that I heard John Rowan Claypool IV preach a handful of times. The way I came to know him is because I'm friends with John Rowan Claypool V and John Rowan Claypool VI. And by that friendship that has been an abiding friendship for years, I was able to break bread with John Claypool, one of my heroes from my seminary days. You'll see in the bio that his book, Tracks of a Fellow Struggler, was instrumental when I read it in Andy Lester's class, Pastoral Care in Human Crisis. It was a double portion for me in that It inspired me that I wanted to be a minister to hurting people. It also was healing to me because just years before, when I was 15 years old, my dear cousin, Stephanie, who had just turned 13 years old, died from an inoperable brain cancer. Having grown up in Western Kentucky and being a child who by that point had already gone to church and not missed Sunday school 9 years in the row, I have the pins to prove it, I turned to a pastor with my questions. And he told me that God always chose the loveliest roses for his garden, and that's why Stephanie had died. It was basically a theological treatise to Billy Joel's Only the Good Die Young. It was not helpful, and for years I struggled trying to make some sense of it, and so Tracts was very helpful to me. I noticed that some of you wrote if you were married or had children, and I am married to Kevin Corlett, who's sitting in the back. I have one child, Mara Catherine Corlett. Kevin and I met in Sunday school here. The Sunday school lesson was on loneliness, and Steve Shoemaker preached on lust, and we went out that afternoon. It's a true story. It was Dwight Cobb's Sunday school class. Steve came to Western Kentucky, to deepest, darkest Cadiz, Kentucky, and performed our ceremony, and he was here back from sabbatical when he dedicated our daughter, and she grew up here, and up until 5 years ago. Kevin and I were here 34 years for me, 32 for him, and then I was called to be senior pastor of a church across town. I told them that I had no interest in being a senior pastor, seeing how my true vocation was chaplaincy. I had spent nearly 25 years in chaplaincy and had retired as the director of pastoral care at the state psychiatric hospital. Once at a park, at a music festival, I said to someone when they asked me what I did for a living, I said, well, I spent 20 years at Central State Hospital. Rowan grabbed me and said she worked there. So I always want to clarify that I was on staff. I brought something I want you to know. I am a perfectionist. I share that with you, fellow struggler. And so I over-prepared for 5 to 7 minutes. I over-prepared while I was babysitting my grandson, Henley Corlett Kamat, named after Henley Barnett. And I want to tell you that Henley and I, while I've babysat him, have listened to so many John Claypool sermons that I am convinced that if John Claypool walked into Mara's front door today, Henley would recognize his voice and consider him a family member. So there's no chapter on John Claypool as healer, so I had to put together just some notes of what I consider outstanding themes. I, too, could have spoken an hour on this, but I have 5 to 7 minutes. And the first thing I want to say is I contend that John Claypool was more than a healer. In every facet of his life, he sought to blaze paths to healing. In his preaching and the celebration of sacraments, we saw him provide the presence of God as he stood and preached, as he handled the elements, as he spoke to us, and someone has already mentioned today, in case you weren't there, it was as if sometimes when he preached that he was preaching directly to you. And one of the reasons is because Dr. Claypool made eye contact with you when he preached. He had no dot on a wall or whatever some classes teach. He looked you in the eye as he spoke with you. And so it had a great sense of intentionality. He also believed in what Dr. Wayne Oates used to say, and that is one of the highest compliments you can be paid as a preacher pastor is for someone to come up to you after your sermon and say, "You touched on some things that really touched me today, and I wondered if you might have some time I could talk with you today." And so he preached with those kinds of ideas in mind as he was affected by people like Henry Nouwen, who had taught him through his reading and speaking about what it meant to be a wounded healer. And Dr. Claypool grasped that idea and carried it out. He was also very influenced by Frederick Buechner. You will find that there are a number of Claypool stories. In fact, I was thinking a wonderful book would be Stories Claypool Told. There are a number of illustrations that he used over and over, and he often used the image of Frederick Buechner on the most awful day of his life after his father took his own life. Later on, he would say he died of heart trouble because he had a heart and it was troubled. And I've heard Dr. Claypool tell that story a number of times, and I'm always moved by it. Also, John Claypool just had one of those voices. I think you know what I'm talking about. One of my mentors, Clarence Barton, said that there are some preachers just have one of those voices. And Clarence went on to say, and what I'm talking about is they could stand in the pulpit and read the phone book, and people would leave there feeling blessed. And John Claypool had one of those voices. And I don't know if this was something he was born with. I suspect it was something that he developed over time, especially as I've learned about his work in speech and debate, even in high school. He also, throughout his preaching, did something that my mentor Clarence talked about, and that is he always put the bread on a shelf everyone could reach. And there's this wonderful, I encourage you, I brought a copy of it today, but I encourage you to find it online. There's this wonderful preaching consultation that he did in Stone Mountain, Georgia. And he includes an entire section about why we as preachers feel the need to use great big words and to talk about the thoughts of great big men like Camus and Kierkegaard. And he said, when we do that, we need to look at the reason we're doing it. Are we doing it to say, look at me, look how smart I am? Or are we using it hoping to educate? And that's something that I really loved about Dr. Claypool, is he always put the bread on the shelf that you could reach it. Also, Dr. Claypool was a prolific author, 11 books. And in each of those books, one of the things that he sought to do was be a healer. And if you want to know whether or not he achieved that, I encourage you to go to Amazon and read the reviews and personal stories that people have included on Amazon about the effect that John Claypool's books have had on their lives. People who'd never heard the name John Claypool, people who knew nothing about him, never knew him as preacher, teacher, but pastor. But because of his writing, they were so moved by the things that he wrote. And that's one of the things that I think that Rowan and I, as we were having a conversation, that little book, Tracks of a Fellow Struggler, was published first in 1974. And in 1974, I was making plans for my sophomore year in high school. That lets you know how long ago it was. It is still in print, and it is still changing people's lives, just as it changed my life when I read it after losing my cousin Stephanie to a brain tumor. Also, he was a beloved professor. I want to quote something that I read that one of his students said that I think encapsulates his spirit. He wrote this to Dr. Claypool: "Beyond being into this student body, choose to be minister, mentor, and friend. You treat us as equals while you are helping us along the journey." And I think it's really funny that Dr. Claypool once was quoted as saying, "I am not a scholar, but I love ideas and study, and I really do love people." And so there's this idea of something being centric, and you'll hear egocentric, and you'll hear agape-centric. And that's what I believe Dr. Claypool was as a healer. He was love-centric. And I believe that he loved in a way that one of my other mentors and therapists, Keith Auerbach, calls vulnerability meets vulnerability. Rather than having a hierarchical relationship where one is above the other, you meet one another face to face, and your brokenness and their brokenness can reach into one another. And I believe that it was because of his willingness to do that, particularly in his willingness to preach about difficult things. It makes it, it's not something that Baptist ministered. One of the reasons I know this, my predecessor was pastor at the church where I am for 65. It wasn't he was 65 years old when he retired. He was 95 years old when he died on a Tuesday after preaching on a Sunday. He was a contemporary of John Claypool. And so when I first came with my preaching style, one of the things that one of the deacons said is, "We really like your little stories, but I think some people would want more meat in the sermons." But as they've come to know me and trust me, then they have seen the importance of being able to be vulnerable and confessional, not only me to them, but with one another. And lastly, I want to talk about Dr. Claypool's power to bless. Now, we've all spent a lot of time already this weekend talking about Dr. Claypool's benedictions. And many of us have benedictions that are associated with us that we use week to week. And Dr. Claypool had a very powerful benediction, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Dr. Claypool's ability to bless you personally. To find something in you that he could affirm, that he could challenge, that he could see, and in a very intentional way be able to bless that in you. And also the way that he would take your hands. Do you remember what it felt like when John Claypool held your hands? Sometimes he would take two hands in his two hands as he spoke with you. And now a funny story, not so much about him, but about Anne. I was able to spend time with the Claypools through my friendship with Rowan and John, and became friends with Anne. And one day, Dr. Claypool had preached at Epiphany Catholic Church. And there was a reception following, and we waited around, and everyone wanted to speak with him, and everyone wanted to talk with him. And at some point, we were all going out to lunch, and so Anne, in her very tender and polite way, walked up and said, "John, I think we need to draw this to a close because I think people are hungry." And he said, of course. And then we walked back across the room, and I looked at Anne in my very not tender way and said, "Thank you so much. I was starting to get hungry. Thanks for saying something." And she said, "Oh, Mara, we're not going anywhere for a while." And I looked at her and she said, "Look over there. John Claypool's gonna cross this room. And that'll take a while." And she was right. It was a full 20 minutes from point A to point B, as he looked at people and shook people's hands and blessed them as we walked out. And when your stomach's growling, it's not so powerful, but as I reflect back on it, it was a powerful moment in his ability to bless. And then lastly, I want to tell you about how John Claypool blessed me. And first, Rowan. A number of years ago, during the interim time here at the church, I was on the committee to help with that interim time. Rowan was on the committee too, and I felt I was in over my head. I think there were people here at this church that felt like I was in over my head too, so I was constantly trying to prove myself. I was trying to make something of myself here. And I had been that way. I wanted to preach like John Claypool, write like Steve Shoemaker. I wanted to know the hearts of children like Catherine Chapman. I wanted to have the grace of Betty Cook. I wanted to have the humor of Grady Nutt and the wit of Henley Barnett, and I wanted to be able to teach like Henley's wife, Helen Porch Barnett. I wanted to practice the presence of God like Glenn Henson, and I wanted to be the kind of therapist that Keith Auerbach was. And while I was trying to do this, Rowan reached over and took my hand, may I take yours? And said, "Don't be so frenetic." Well, I went home and looked up frenetic. I didn't like what it said. It said, great activity, somewhat uncontrolled. But the next thing, I didn't like that. But the next thing said, for instance, someone who is trying to do 10 things at once. I not only was trying to be 10 things, do 10 things, I was trying to be 10 people at once. And one day at a Mexican restaurant, as I talked with Dr. Claypool, he interrupted me. I was probably being frenetic. And he said, "Never forget that God called you." And as someone who had a hard time believing that God could ever use someone like me, Dr. Claypool said, "Why would you go downstairs and dig for treasure in the cellar if you thought there was nothing there?" And so I started a self-examined life. And I let God heal me of that. And it's constantly a journey. But through John Rowan Claypool IV and John Rowan Claypool V, I was blessed. And a beginning to healing began. And so I feel like there's so much I could say, and I know there's more that you could say. But I also want to tell you one more thing, and that is I'm grateful for all the John Rowan Claypools in my life. And I once saved a portrait of the first John Claypool from catching fire. Ask me about it sometime.
I switched mics. I don't know if we're on board here, but
The next speaker is Dr. David Hull, who is just a wonderful human. But if you know the Claypool story, you don't have to go very far to know how intertwined the Hull family and the Claypool family are. Dr. Hull's father preached Laura Lou's funeral and Dr. Claypool's funeral, and his beautiful piece on Dr. Claypool when he died is this beautiful. One of the things that Dr. Claypool always told me about your dad is, we've heard all this politicking kind of behind the scenes in Baptist life, and Dr. Claypool was recommended for such and such a job. What he told me is, he goes, I never really looked for a job. Bill would just tell me when they were open, and that's how I knew. And that was his recommendation. But David has had an illustrious career as pastor, including in my hometown of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I have to also add that his daughter, Emily Hull McGee, was an absolutely wonderful preacher, and he now lives near her with his family. So, David.
Thank you. And my daughter is now my pastor. Right. I, more than anyone on this panel, would wish that my professor, Dr. Raymond Bailey, was sitting right here to talk about his chapter of the book. But I will do my very best to be substitute teacher. Dr. Bailey had one interesting connection. I was ordained in this church 42 years ago this summer, and Dr. Bailey chaired my ordination council, because at that point, Crescent Hill was in an interim season, and he was the interim pastor. So there is great irony or providence or connection or something that I would sit here and talk a bit about preaching. He has written a wonderful chapter in this book in which Dr. Bailey especially goes back to Dr. Claypool's Lyman Beecher lectures on preaching and gives us a summary of that. Now, I brought both of them. The preaching event, many of you have read. If you haven't, that's how you can learn about John Claypool preaching. If you don't want to read that whole book, you read Ray Bailey's chapter in this book, and it will give a wonderful summary of that. As I was thinking about what do I say, the thought of me sitting here and explaining what Dr. Bailey wrote in that chapter and sort of teaching it brought to mind the biblical story of young David trying to fight the battle wearing Saul's armor. So I'm not going to just teach what Dr. Bailey would have said. I encourage you to read the book. Let me do maybe what Dr. Claypool taught us to do, and let me be a little more personal, a little more confessional in my own understanding of John Claypool's preaching. I grew up in this church from the time I was 5 until I was 16. Very appropriately, the Hulls sat right about where Ryan Price and Charlie Johnson are desecrating our pew right over there. And appropriately, the Hulls sat right behind the Nuts. I'm so glad we've got family right there. So I heard John Claypool as preacher from a boy up to a teenager. During all those years, I never once expected that I would be a preacher. I was going to be a lawyer. and my dad was the preacher. I was not going to be. But it's interesting now, 42 years later, looking back on that many years of a preaching ministry, how much I learned from that pew, watching my pastor, listening to my pastor preach, how his preaching impacted me. So let me give you 4 words. And as I think I'm the last one to say anything today about John Claypool. What is left to be said? Because in many ways, the things I'm going to say have already been said today. But that's okay. Let me give you my take on it. The first word I would give to you is always the first word when you talk about John Claypool and preaching, and that's the word confession. Confession. That was the emphasis of Ray Bailey's chapter, confessional preaching. That was the emphasis of the Lyman Beecher lectures. But my experience of it as a boy was hearing my pastor talk about some of the struggles of his life, talk about wanting to be king of the mountain or president of the world. And I wanted to be president of everything in those days, and what he was saying resonated with me. And Alan Culpepper was exactly right. Confessional preaching for John did not begin with Laura Lou's illness. It was already happening well before that. And I was sitting right there listening, engaged and drawn in by the story of his own life, his own confession. And sometimes it was the deep struggles of his life, but sometimes I remember him saying, I grew up with wavy hair and I wanted to have straight hair. And I grew up with the name John, but I wanted to have the name Dick. You know, and little things like that stick in a young boy's heart. I had straight hair and wanted it to be wavy at that point. I don't ever remember wanting to be called Dick, but I do remember thinking, you know, almost thinking about my hair as John was talking. And the stories he told of his life, the confession of his own heart drew me in. And I understood that was the way to preach. Then I went to seminary. And I went to the seminary that I had also grown up in, not just this church, but Southern Seminary, where my dad had been a professor. My first teacher of preaching, or the fancy word for that, we call it, is homiletics, was the renowned pulpiteer, Dr. George Buttrick. And I was just honored to have him as a teacher. He was a pulpit giant of the 20th century, the renowned preacher who also had a soon-to-be renowned grader. H. Stephen Shoemaker right down there was my grader in preaching class, and Dr. Buttrick was as clear as crystal. You do not talk about yourself. You never use I, the personal pronoun. And so there's little wonder that there was some confusion in my preaching in the early years about finding my voice between the model of confessional preaching and the wonderful teaching of Dr. Buttrick. Over the years, I'm guessing it's Dr. Buttrick who's rolled over in his grave a few times related to my preaching, because the impact of confession was so important to me. And I have tried to use that in my own preaching. But it was shaped right there on that pew. The second word I would offer for you is the word repetition. Repetition. A group of us sat up into the night last night just talking about preaching with John, about John. And I wonder how many campfires were around in Louisville last night talking about John and his preaching. But one of the conversation points is something I had already planned to say, but it was interesting. John repeated himself a lot. You all know about having roast preacher for Sunday lunch. Do you know about that? People do that. At our house, roast preacher was never a criticism of Dr. Claypool, but we would talk about the sermon, and I still remember a number of times when I would say, there he did it again. Dr. Claypool got on the prodigal son again today. So that when I was in seminary, I wrote a paper on John Claypool's preaching of grace. And in his 11 years at Crescent Hill, I read every sermon. 13 times the prodigal son was the primary text for the sermon. And then many more times it became a biblical illustration of, one of his points. There was that biblical story, but then there were his life stories, about salt and light. We heard them today. You are salt, you are light. And we heard them again and again. And the reason that there are Claypoolisms, as I think the McAfee crowd came up with that term, the reason they're Claypoolisms is because John repeated these things again and again, so that what Carolyn Ratliff was reading from Life as Gift this morning, if you were in the earliest session, of the many sayings that were associated with him, we have them, we know them, because he repeated them. I used to think I had to have a fresh sermon, a fresh idea every week, and never reuse anything. But then I began to remember my pastor and how the act of repetition was so important for learning, and how so much of what I learned is because he told those stories again and again. And just like our favorite hymns are often ones that we sing many times, tomorrow morning we're going to sing what around here we call the Crescent Hill hymn. I believe it was written for Steve's installation service. I'm glad it didn't just stop as an installation hymn, but it was again and again and again. And that's how I remember John's preaching, and that's given me freedom to say something more than once, and to tell a story more than once, and to even preach a sermon more than once. Because if you were like many of us and you got the sermons in printed form from church to church to church to church, there was repetition, and that's great. Third word, delivery. Delivery. We talked about the voice. You talked about the voice. But for me, it was sitting right there and knowing that John was looking right at me. He wasn't reading to me. He wasn't, it wasn't something scripted. In fact, I once asked him, do you memorize? Because there usually weren't notes. Do you memorize? And I love what he said, no, I internalize. So the message of the day becomes so much a part of who he is, internalized, that he then is able to give it out while looking right at you and you and you. I've tried to do that. That's impacted my preaching to where I often fail with that, but that becomes a goal of preaching because I want to have that same connection that my pastor had with me on that pew. And then the fourth word is humor. It's not often put in critical writing about John Claypool's preaching, but because he was so confessional, and because he was often bearing his soul, and because he was connecting and his delivery was looking right at us, and there was a sincerity about him and who he was, that when he would make that little aside, it could often become very funny. He was not a stand up and warm up the crowd with jokes like some preachers do, just to get them ready for the sermon. That wasn't it at all. If you watched on the video we saw this morning, everything that I've just talked about was in it. It struck me this morning as we watched. There was confession as he told his story, and he talked of the woman who worked in his house and his own struggles with race, and that was confession. There was repetition. Because how many of us who have come to this thing have never heard that despair is presumptuous? Yeah, we know that. He said it again, and the crowd who heard him that day had heard it before. But part of the way we hold on to things like that is there is repetition. We saw in his delivery a man who was looking right at us. But then there was that humor. I love the picture of the rabbi in the cloud of smoke on Mount Sinai, just ascending up. It's that kind of thing. In his Beecher lectures, He tells the story, once again, confessional, of how he was growing up, and he wanted to be captain of the safety patrol, but someone else's mother was more connected to the principal, and that little boy got to be captain, and he ended up being lieutenant, and that was a terrible blow for him to be lieutenant. And then, as an aside, he said, "A word I cannot spell to this very day." You laughed. The people who were listening laughed. And as John would do that, then the connection continued, and the message that he was sharing moved from his heart into our hearts. So I'm grateful that John was my pastor, that he was my teacher, that he certainly was my healer. But I'm also grateful that he was the preacher who not only helped me know how to be a Christian, but he was the preacher who taught me how to preach.
How are we doing on time? Do we have time for Q&A, or do we want to call it a day? Oh. All right. Does anyone have any questions for the panel?